Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, the co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Today, we'd like to discuss a little bit about the future of the economy, because a few of us think that the future doesn't bode well, that there's going to be some problems because our prosperity has been built on inflation, that is the creation of new money and a lot of government spending, and therefore it's fragile. But not too many people believe in it. At least the big money on Wall Street believe it's a new paradigm. It'll last forever. We've heard that many times, all the way back in the 1920s. New paradigms, it doesn't have to have a correction. So there are the true believers. There are others who are traders who know, well, it may end, but it's not ending yet. In the meantime, I'm going to make a buck, and they're pretty good. Some will be nimble, and they'll be able to get out. But the one thing about Austrian economics, which you're very familiar with, is that in Austrian economics, the predictions of bubbles bursting and a downturn in the economy are very, very good and very, very accurate. But they are not a whole lot better than anybody else. So we might be able to predict that there's a distortion and an imbalance, and there will be a correction. We don't even pretend we can pick the date. You know, oh, this will happen. They gave me a lot of credit for predicting and talking about the housing bubble. The housing bubble was going to burst. But if you'd have asked me back then when it was going to happen, because I had said it for a couple years before it happened, I wouldn't have known, you know, the exact date and when that whole thing would come down. And I think that's the way it is. So Austrian economics is a good teacher, but it teaches the truth that human action is involved, human activities and emotions are involved, unintended consequences, these certain events are all unpredictable, and sometimes the trust in the economy and the euphoria which Trump portrays, you know, he does give the Wall Streeters some encouragement, you know, lower taxes and lower regulations. So it's a little bit different than it's ever been. So I think this is an important issue to deal with about where this economy is coming. And I know you have given this some thought, and you probably agree that we better get prepared.
Yes, absolutely. And candidate Trump, when he was running for president, he was right on the money. He said that the American economy was a big fat bubble, and he was right. And that bubble still has not burst, but he's now flipped positions. Now he's taking credit for it, and it's just bigger. Now it still has to burst, and it will at some point. And we know for sure that the media, the establishment, they will be blaming Trump. It's going to be all his fault, his tariffs. They may even find a way to blame Russia, who knows. And we also know that President Trump is not going to take the blame himself. So he's going to be pointing the fingers somewhere. And the question is where. Now, we know where he should point the fingers, and that's the Federal Reserve. And I guess it's yet to be seen if he's able to do that.
Yes, and making these predictions about who will get blamed, again, is something that I don't think anybody knows exactly, but we can sort of project about what we think might happen. And because of the character and the nature and personality of Trump, it'll be interesting to see what will happen. But history shows that in general, if there's a good economy, the president gets credit, even though he had probably very, very little to do with it. When there is a deep recession or depression or a crash, the president in office usually gets blamed. And a good example of this is what happened in the Depression. You know, in '29, when the stock market crashed, of course, Hoover was blamed. And he was at fault. He was not a true free market person, but he himself wasn't to blame. It was the Federal Reserve inflation throughout the 20s that was to blame. But history has proven he's been labeled. He was the call, Hooverism. Everybody knows about it. And though he participated in it, he wasn't the major cause, and like you've already indicated, the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with these problems. But I think it's interesting looking at FDR. FDR comes in and think conditions are bad, and he becomes arch conservative. He takes in the gold, he has bank holidays, spends more money, and did he make things better? Most people, I'll bet you, if you talk to the average person, either wouldn't have the vaguest idea if they were just graduating from high school about the Depression. But a lot of people say, yeah, Roosevelt got us out of the Depression, and he helped out, and he bailed people out, and he had a war, and when you're in war, the economy picks up. So he got all the credit, but the truth is, he made it much worse, and he prolonged it. Most people argue that the Depression lasted until the end of World War II, because I remember World War II, and believe me, the economy was very depressed. We didn't have very much stuff, and everything went into the war effort. So the Depression of the 30s went into the war, and yet Roosevelt never really got any blame. He's considered a hero both for the war and for getting us out of the Depression. So I think we have a job if we are going to be able to predict or at least anticipate who's going to get blamed for the next one. It's important because if a certain thing gets blamed that really wasn't the cause, instead of blaming the Fed and they blame free enterprise, that's what they did in the 30s. They blamed free enterprise and the gold standard. And it turned out that it made things much worse.
Yes, and Donald Trump, we all know it. This is a different type of president than has ever been. Here's someone who has tremendous influential power with his tweets, and he just goes right past the media. You don't even need the media. You could go right to him, and that's what most people do. And he has this ability to brand like the media, the fake news media. It's the first thing you think, and crooked Hillary. I mean, what if he was to turn that onto the Federal Reserve, who has never faced anything like that? The media always covers for the Fed, and the presidents never go after him. And President Trump may not either, because the Fed is the engine of big government. They are they finance the warfare and welfare state. And Trump is a big government guy. So, it's just going to be interesting times that we go into.
And Trump's been known to flip-flop. He changed his opinion, and rarely is he very consistent. And you mentioned that he already complained about the bubble when he was a candidate, but now he's already after the Fed, and the crash hasn't even yet come, but he's arguing with the Fed, don't you raise those interest rates. They're practically just down near zero. Don't raise those interest rates. He's already badgering the Fed. But what I find a real irony is the United States is, doing well, even in spite of all this. Trump's messing it up. He's introduced this notion that the things that he doesn't like will be solved with tariffs and sanctions and this sort of thing. But what amazes me is the rant that says, we are really getting messed up. We're being taken advantage of. We're suffering the consequences. It sounds like we have nothing, and blaming everybody else for our problem. And yet we're the richest. We get to print the reserve currency of the world. We have all the weaponry. Everybody takes our money, and we have more wealth than anybody. And yet he makes it sound like we are, a basket case, which is sort of ironic. I guess he's appealing to two different things. Later on, it'll be more concrete when this market turns down. One reason why I knew the bubble was building like never before, because we had this strange things when QEs were going on after the last recession. It took $3+ trillion of new money in the monetary base to try to encourage it, and the market wasn't responding. They didn't understand human action. The money was being parked and did not go into stimulating the economy. So their goal was the Keynesians equate a good economy with rising prices, which is a fallacy. A good economy with sound money, prices go down. Your dollar value and purchase power goes up. The standard of living goes up. But because the symbol of rising prices to them was the symbol of a growing economy, they say, how do we get the inflation rate? That means their inflation is the cost of living up. How can we take away, even more purchasing power than we admit to? Of course, they're losing purchasing power anyway. If we could just get that statistic up to 2%, everything is going to be okay. To me, that it was absolutely bizarre. And the truth is, inflation was much higher then, and it's higher now. And inflation can be associated with recessions and, of course, depression. That's really one of the points we wanted to make today, because in the 70s we had stagflation, and sort of the economists and the politicians were throwing up their hands, and they say, "Oh no! When you have stagnation and recession, prices go down," and they worried about the 1930s. So we had rising prices, price controls, and prices going up at a 15% rate, and interest rates at 21%, and yet the economy was weak. So they invented this term stagflation. But if that goes to an extreme, you move in the direction of Zimbabwe, and you move in the direction of Venezuela, and then you can have inflationary depressions. And that is what I believe is coming. Can't prove it. Other things can happen, but I think there is no way they're going to allow the deflation. People say, well, the prices are going down in here, here, and here. That is not deflation. Deflation is when the money supply shrinks. It did that in the 1930s. Sure, you're going to have prices go up and down and some, but basically the cost of living is going up. I've talked to people recently that are in retirement, and they are very concerned about their cost of living, watching the price of bread and this sort of thing. So that is something that is coming, and it's going to be a real shocker, because if that gets out of hand, it may advance to such a stage where it's going to be very difficult to correct. And that's why I've always been involved in this issue of monetary policy, because there is an answer, there is a prevention for this. And that is just having a sound economic policy, having sound money, and get out of the business of having a central bank like ours that can print the world currency. Nobody should have central banks. In the healthy stages of economic growth throughout the world, there was essentially no central banks. But they basically followed the principle that a currency had to be defined as a weight of gold, and that was quite a bit different. So this is going to be a challenge, because like we started off, is what's Trump going to say? What is he going to do? Who's he going to blame? Because he likes executive orders. I mean, Roosevelt liked executive orders too. If he could write an executive order and steal all the gold from the people, then you can imagine, what Trump might do if he says that don't raise these interest rates. You don't know exactly what that will consequence. So, and the other thing is, in the Depression, they wanted prices to stay up, so they tried to force prices up. And of course, in the corrections, as you know, Chris, prices actually go down to correct. Labor goes down, prices go down, the corrections made, debt is liquidated, malinvestment is liquidated, and then you can have growth again. And that's what they're refusing to have. So those are the kind of things we just don't know how it will work out.
Yeah, and central planning, central banking, intervention, it's all a basket case. And you make a great point. How can, on the one hand, President Trump say the whole world is ripping us off, and on the other say that our economy is the envy of the world? I mean, which is it? Are we suffering, or are we this big prosperity? And we've done several shows, and people can look in our archives about how you shouldn't put up tariffs. But the president is a meddler, and he put up tariffs. And this last week, we're seeing now that the farmers are suffering. So now they're going to get corporate welfare, $12 billion. So this is an example of how one government intervention and problem leads to a fix, which is an even bigger problem. Now, will there be other corporations that say, hey, Washington's handing out free money? Will they want to get on the bandwagon and get their corporate welfare too? I would say, of course they will. So this is how it snowballs, and the answer is to just get the government out of our economy.
Yeah, and your point about the trade war is important, because the trade war is related to monetary policy. It's very natural. If we can print the world currency, that's cheap. We could spend more money overseas than buy cheap goods, and our standard of living goes up, and that's why we're doing well. And if you look at just trade balances, oh, this doesn't work out quite right, but it's really a bargain for us that we print money, because there's always a balance of payments. We buy stuff, they have to buy our debt, that sort of thing. But there's more to it than just the trade war, because push comes to shove, the countries don't like it. Right now, it's really weird. Supercharged more tariffs versus no tariffs at all. Trump throws out let's just cancel them all. that's not likely to happen. But that's the extreme. That's raise them a law, or let's get rid of everything, and that's his way of negotiating. But trade wars generally lead to currency wars. And yes, we're in the driver's seats on currencies, but other countries are having their second thoughts on it, and they can band together and start devaluing their currency. And I think that's going on with China and other nations, and they're looking for alternatives to the reserve currency of the world. Because this policy we have right now might be ushering in the final stages, which could take a year or two or a lot longer, where the dollar is removed. But if you go from trade wars to currency wars, then you so often go into bitterness. And we see the bitterness being increased by the wars being fought with money created by the Fed. And look at our activities in the Middle East and all that activity. We couldn't do that without the Fed. They print the money and run up the debt. And you mentioned right there, they create one problem and say, oh, well, let's bail out the farmers. And the GDP will go up and this sort of thing. It's crazy. You just think the more wars we fight, the higher the GDP, because we're building weapons and we're getting wealthier, not thinking about why are poor people not doing well. And right now, when we look at the GDP figure, they're important for the markets, the daily shifts. But who really looks at them? Most people don't care. Probably 90%, especially the 90% who are suffering, GDP means nothing to them. And those who look at them carefully, the traders, might do it and believe, we're moving in the right direction and it's a new paradigm. But it also might be that there are some there that realize it and they're starting to ease out and get out of the market, and I think some of that is going on. But eventually they'll lose control of that. No matter what they do, it is impossible because the debt is too big, the malinvestment is out of control, they can't handle the student debt and the pension debt and the Social Security. The debt will limit all this and the confidence will be lost. So no matter how they tinker and how they participate in this mischief at the Fed is not going to be able to bail out no matter how well their intentions are. The Fed is the culprit. The Fed, so much of these secondary things come because the Fed is there, and the worst part about the Fed, it's done in total secrecy. Chris, do you have a final thought?
Yes, and maybe President Trump, it's speculation, could shed some light on that secrecy, but who knows? But that's the final word for us, Dr. Paul, is for our viewers, the people watching this show. No matter who they blame, you should know that it is the Federal Reserve manipulating interest rates, creating money. They create these illusory prosperity, which is followed by a very real and painful bust. We need sound money, free markets, and voluntary exchanges.
And that's not difficult to approach from a moral viewpoint, which is not entertaining. I one time said the two weakest arguments on the House floor was a moral argument and a constitutional argument. But the moral argument for money is that it's equivalent to counterfeit. The founders hated counterfeit, and they didn't like fiat money. Only silver and gold were to be legal tender, and also that you could not issue bills of credit, which was paper money. So they were very much aware of this. But the debt limits are so big that they cannot be sustained. Eventually, they will be liquidated. But the real problem, I think, with this is that the result of the system we have is the increase in the power of government. The increase in the power, whether it's the welfare state or the warfare state or the 1%ers who get an unfair advantage, it's all done in secrecy and very people know about it. But it does cause chaos and hatred. And that's why we're seeing social chaos and talk of civil strife and civil war, because they're not looking in the right places for the right blame. They want to blame, free markets and people who make profits, and which is very, very dangerous. And all of a sudden we see the rising up of people actually saying, vote for me, I'm a socialist. So those are dangerous notions. But in spite of it all, I'm still very optimistic that we're making inroads and making progress in the understanding of economic policies. There's so many more people now know about Austrian economics and knowing about the central bank. I think we've made progress in the last 10 years calling attention to the Federal Reserve and just asking for an audit of the Fed. So we're making progress, but to correct it and move from what we have to a much better system will not be smooth. What I want to do is hope and pray that we can participate enough to prevent us deteriorating into something like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. It is preventable if we do the right thing, but it's a real challenge. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.